Thank you folks for coming out today. Wow, that's kind of loud. I'm hopeful that my cheerful demeanor will make up in some way for the depressing topic today. Well, I wanted to change it. Okay, thank you. So we're going to come back to this map, but many of us, when we think about pollution, environmental challenges in China, this is what we think about. This is Harbin. It's a city in northern China. There was a, this is a picture of some of the buildings in the city. These are some of the people on the streets of the city. This was actually from earlier this year. There was a particular day when the combination of smog and pollution got so bad that it made global headlines. 16 of the 20 most heavily air polluted cities in the world are located in China. How many of you have been to China? If you've been to a big city in China, especially during the winter when they burn coal, you know what I'm talking about. And yet, the stunning reality is that air pollution is not China's most serious environmental problem. China's most serious environmental problem is kind of symbolized by this. If I can, it was just here. Yeah, this. Does anyone recognize what this is?
Pigs.
They're pigs, that's right. Do you connect it with China at all? Or?
How many thousands of pigs were floating down the river, and how that happened?
These were, last March, the good citizens of Shanghai woke up to the Huangpu River, which travels through the middle of Shanghai, and it's also the main source of their drinking water, to see 16,000 pig carcasses floating down the river. Now actually, the irony is that this was, their presence on the river represented, in some ways, a bit of progress, because what happened is that over the past decade or so, China, like Iowa, has been rapidly expanding their pork production, particularly building hog confinement lots like the ones we have here, except maybe not quite as big. And of course, 2 to 4% of the pigs each year come down with diseases. Usually they, a whole herd will catch the same disease. And they're supposed to send them to rendering plants to be processed, the carcasses. But the number of plants for that purpose has fallen way behind the actual number of pigs that they have. So what was happening is that farmers would sell diseased pigs on the black market, and they were slaughtered and sold for meat. Chinese authorities caught wind of this and cracked down on that. So then the farmers said, well, we can't sell it on the black market anymore, and there are not enough processing plants, so they threw it in the river. This is a startling incident, but it's really not that out of sync with what's happened in China and its water overall. So I'm going to talk about some of these challenges, focusing on 3 major issues: scarcity, quality, and management. So let's start with scarcity, and I'm going to throw some statistics at you. China, the United Nations has singled out China as one of 13 countries that are suffering from severe water scarcity. The per capita water availability, and you have to keep in mind that China's about 4 times as many people as the United States. So on a per capita basis, China has about 20% of the freshwater resources that the United States does. It's only 1/5 our level. And because of overuse of water, in part, China did a river census in the 1990s. They counted about 50,000 rivers. They did another census just a few years ago, only 22,000 rivers. They've lost over half the rivers. 13% of their lakes have dried up in the last 40 years. 1/2 of their coastal wetlands have been lost to reclamation. China has 20% of the world's population, but only 7% of the world's arable land, one of the lowest ratios of arable land to population in the world. And they're heavily dependent upon irrigated agriculture. Agriculture accounts for about 2/3 of China's water use. And 45% of their agricultural land is irrigated, compared to only 11% in the United States. And that irrigated land accounts for a disproportionate share of their overall food production. Now, what's worrisome is that northern China has about 42% of China's population. It produces 45%, it also has 45% of its agricultural land, but it has only 11% of China's freshwater resources. So China's big problem is that its water resources are concentrated in the south, but about almost half the population and a great deal of their grain-growing regions are in the north, especially wheat. North China Plain is their main wheat-growing region of China. But you can see the rivers coming down, the Mekong, the Pearl River, the Yangtze River in the south, coming down from the Himalayas. And then you have the Yellow River in the north and the Wei River. But most of China's water resources are in the south. The north has not only a lot of its people and agricultural land, it's also where most of the coal is located. That's important because China depends on coal for 70% of its energy. And coal, because you have to wash the coal mining is a very water-intensive process. And now they're moving into coal gasification, using coal to produce to extract gas for fuel. That's also very water-intensive. Also, the most promising regions for fracking, for using hydraulic fracturing for getting oil and gas out of the rocks beneath the soil. That also is very water-intensive, as we know. So the use of coal, gasification, fracking, all of that is expanding in northern China and sucking up water and competing, therefore, with agricultural uses. Now, is there enough water in the north to satisfy both uses? Well, the answer is no. The water table beneath the North China Plain is sinking by 1 meter every year. Chinese scientists estimate by the year 2030, most of the aquifer beneath the North China Plain will be depleted. Beijing draws water from wells that now have to reach as far as 1 kilometer beneath the earth in order to pull up water. In the last 6 decades, per capita water availability in Beijing has fallen by 75%. And yet, Beijing's population is over 20 million now, and it's growing by 500,000 every year. One of the other concerns is that because China has only about half the percentage of its land area is devoted to forest as the United States, and it's rapidly losing forest, although they are carrying out an aggressive campaign to try to plant forests. Nevertheless, the desertification is taking place, and the Gobi Desert is actually expanding. Its furthest extent is only about 100 miles from Beijing, and it's encroaching each year. In the spring each year, there are these massive windstorms, sandstorms, that dump about 330,000 tons of sand on Beijing. And you can go and see inches thick sort of set very, kind of fine sand on cars and buildings around the city. People wear masks. Okay, so that's the issue of quantity and scarcity. I'm going to talk a little bit more later about a big project that China's engaged in trying to rectify this problem, or at least address it in some way. Another big major issue is water quality. Less than half of Chinese cities have wastewater treatment plants. Of those who do, many of them don't have adequate capacity. So only about, according to one urban survey, only about 23% of sewage is treated. The rest is simply flushed down untreated. And in fact, 700 million Chinese drink water that's contaminated with human and animal waste. Over 40% of China's rivers are heavily polluted. 20% of them are not suitable for human contact. That's not to say it's not drinkable water. You get sick if you touch the water, if you come in human contact with the water. And in fact, that water is so polluted that it's not permitted for, it's not safe for either agricultural or even industrial use. Let's see a few images that give us a sense of what we're talking about. This is water pollution on the Sunhua River, which reaches Harbin. I think it was maybe 2005. There was a major benzene spill that harmed the drinking water of a major city. One of the unfortunate aspects of that is that spill was covered up for a number of days before officials finally, came forth with the information. We'll see this again and again in these photos. Just algae that covers the lakes because of nitrates and phosphates and other chemicals from agriculture that run off into the streams and lakes. Much of it from overuse of chemicals in agriculture. And it promotes algae blooms that then suck all the oxygen out of the water and leads to the death of fish and other marine life. This is pollution. Now this is a reservoir. I'll talk later about how that kind of debris builds up around dams. It's a man swimming in a polluted river, a canal in Beijing. More algae. This is leaked sewage tank at a copper mine. This is an oil spill. This is a heart-rending image. I'm not sure what kind of pollutant that is. That's a factory. So, water quality is a major issue. Another set of issues concern how China manages its water, and what I have in mind in particular here is the over-construction of dams. You've probably heard of the Three Gorges Dam, the biggest construction project in world history, the biggest dam that's what is it, 2.5 times the size of the Hoover Dam, something like that. It's an enormous dam. It was completed in 2003. Even the leadership now in Beijing is unwilling. You know, they had I guess a 10-year celebration of the dam's construction, and the top leaders stayed away because they don't want to be associated with the dam because its reputation is so negative. It was created. It does serve some important purposes. It helps to create energy and electricity, and of course, for China, the major alternative to hydroelectric is coal. They have very dirty, soft coal, and that leads to not just local air pollution, but also contributes to global warming. So Chinese leaders defend dams as necessary to fight, to avoid using more coal. It's also used as a means of fighting against periodic floods. So dams do have their uses. They can help with irrigation projects and that kind of thing. But in the case of the Three Gorges Dam and many of these other dams that have been built, they also have a lot of negative factors. The dam has devastated fisheries around the Three Gorges Dam. The fish can't spawn, and there are other ways in which it changes the temperature of the river and has threatened hundreds of species of fish. Every year, about 200,000 cubic meters of floating debris back up behind the dam and have to be somehow extracted, and then they have to find a place to put them, and they've not yet solved that problem. The dam's been there have been growing numbers of landslides that have contributed to the effects of the reservoir. The reservoir itself took up an enormous amount of land in terms of replacing land that had been used for farming or that was forested. About 1.3 million people were displaced. Many of them were farmers who did not get equally valuable farmland. Many of them ended up living basically in very poor circumstances on the outer edge of major cities and unable to really acclimate to urban life. But China has not given up on dams. China already accounts for about 1/2 of the major dams in the world, and is either constructing or has plans to construct at least another 150 major dams. Most of them, we can go back to the map, most of them will be located in the southwest region. One of the problems this creates is that by damming up these rivers to such an extent, it's interrupting the flow of water to the downstream users in Southeast Asia along the Mekong, and it's creating international tensions with those countries. So China has certainly quite a few challenges. Now, China is not the only country that has faced environmental challenges. Does anybody recognize this picture?
Is that Cleveland?
Yeah. Is that you, Jerry?
Cleveland, yeah.
This is Cleveland, the Cuyahoga River, 1969. I think this was the 4th or 5th time that the Cuyahoga had caught fire. That's a river on fire, folks. You don't see that every day, at least not anymore. Apparently Cleveland, if you lived in Cleveland, you saw it on a regular basis, but this was one of the events, along with Love Canal, along with some others, that kind of sparked an environmental movement in the United States and helped to lead to the passage of the Clean Water Act. And of course, Clean Air Act, and the same year, the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency. So, in a sense, dirtying your nest is part of the process of development. When countries reach a certain level of affluence, they begin prioritizing the environment more than one more increment of GDP, and begin reallocating their resources to try to clean up the environment or prevent pollution in the first place. Now, the United States certainly doesn't have a perfect record, but I think we have made progress since the late 60s. And the question is, well, what about China? Can China make progress? Can China deal with these environmental issues in the coming years? Well, one thing I think is clear is that the leadership in China now understands that they have a serious problem. We used to get a lot of rhetoric about, China has an inherent right to develop and use its resources as it sees fit, which is, obviously true, but development that undercuts your future sustainability is an odd kind of development. So, in recent years, China's leaders have, I think, come to understand much more deeply that they have to pay attention to the environment, in part because it's starting to exact a real economic toll. It's becoming a bottleneck to development. And also in part because it becomes a political risk. That in 2005, China used to track and kind of make public the number of what they call mass incidents, basically public protests, illegal in most cases. And at that time, they attributed about 50,000 mass protests to environmental issues. That number, once the number got too big, they stopped, announcing it. I'm sure they still track it. They just don't make it public anymore. I'm sure that figure would be much higher now. Some of the most celebrated protests have been quite large. In 2004, there was a protest against the, I think it was the Pubayu Dam, that led to about 100,000 people gathered at the dam site to try to stop the construction of the dam. That protest was crushed, and its leaders were arrested, and the dam went ahead. But nevertheless, the Communist Party is worried about political unrest and instability, and is always looking for ways to try to address it. Also, China's learned because it's had opportunities through all kinds of international agencies, summits, conferences, to interact with folks from other parts of the world, scientists, environmental NGOs, and it's been a learning process of learning about what some of the risk factors are and how to address them. Nevertheless, China's efforts to deal with water problems are still not yet up to what's necessary. One reason is that the State Environmental Protection Agency doesn't have the status, the size, or the political clout of other agencies against which it's competing over development priorities. And so it will get overruled by economic agencies who have an interest in promoting growth. Another problem is that much of China's laws are not so bad. It's that the enforcement is delegated mostly to the local level. And the local environmental protection agencies or bureaus are actually subordinate to local political officials. And therefore, those politicians or local political leaders often see economic development as a higher priority than the environment and overrule their own environmental agencies. One reason they see economic development as a priority is because the Communist Party elevates people who have high economic growth records in their locality. They're trying to change the system now, promotion, to emphasize the environment more. But I don't think that we have any evidence that it's had any real effect so far. Also, the local governments, they get money in part from selling land to developers who then build factories or housing or something, and then the local government gets money that way. They don't have property taxes. So they condemn property, they sell it to local developers, and they get money. And many times even the local governments will have an ownership stake in local industries. Aside from which, people always talk about corruption as the first thing. It's not so much outright bribes, although certainly that occurs, but it's more the entanglement of local governments with the other economic actors so that they see their interests as coinciding. Another problem is fragmentation. You know, major river basins cut across so many different geographical jurisdictions. And then you lay over on top of that functional jurisdiction, you know, the agencies in charge of the forest, another agencies in charge of agriculture, another agencies in charge of, local water quality, another agencies in charge of development. They all have overlapping responsibilities, and there's simply not enough coordination among them, and there's no central oversight to force them to cooperate with one another. So getting together a regional environmental protection plan for a river basin, let's say, is almost an impossible task. Another major problem is that China is not yet a system run by rule of law. There has been progress, but it's still a system run by people, by the party. And so what happens is that there'll be a major environmental crisis like the Benzene spill in the Sangwon River that threatened Harbin's drinking supply. There'll be a major crisis, and it will embarrass the party, and the media will cover it, and the party then will announce we're going to have a major campaign. We're going to have a 3-year campaign to clean up the river, right? And then they send out orders right and left, and they allocate money and everything. And so it's a big campaign, and it has a time limit, and it's mobilizing resources in the short term, but it's not a commitment to long-term institution building and to clear accountability, to clear rules and laws. And so at the end of 3 years, they announce success, and then they go back to the way things were before. And often, even during those campaigns, it means that they send out a flood of inspectors, and then the factories, they just close down for a few days, or they hide their toxic waste, and then they go on with their business when the inspectors are gone. And another big problem is, I wish I could remember his name right now, Peter Bleek. Peter Bleek is a water expert. He says there's a hard path and a soft path to dealing with water issues. The hard path is large, capital-intensive, centralized, top-down, and supply-focused solutions. The example, Three Gorges Dam is a hard path approach to dealing with water. Another hard path approach would be the North-South Water Transfer Project. This shows you these are the 3 major canals, and then these two are what we call the Western Canal. These are the 3 major canals that are taking water from the Yangtze River up to the Yellow River. So basically, what they're doing is diverting 6 trillion gallons of water each year, or at least when it's complete, it will divert 6 trillion gallons of water each year from south to north. That's how they want to solve the problem of water scarcity in the north. Just take the water from the south to the north. The first 2 canals are basically done and will soon be in operation. The Western Canal is is still on the drawing boards. It will take decades to complete. It's by far the most difficult because these are mountains. The engineering challenge here is enormous, and it will be together. This will be by far the biggest infrastructure project ever attempted, and the total price tag at this point is $62 billion. I'm sure it will rise over time. I won't go into it, but there's, environmentalists have a lot of concerns about this. The water that they're diverting is itself polluted water. As the lakes and rivers in the south are depleted from drawing water out, the concentration of chemicals actually gets worse. Get the same amount of chemicals in there and less water to diffuse them. So there are a lot of concerns. And it's a very expensive, capital-intensive way to solve the problem. Another thing that they're trying, which is another very expensive option, is building desalinization plants along the coast. Now, the other path is the soft path. And GLEEC here means small, inexpensive, decentralized, participatory, demand-focused, efficient, and reasonable options. An example would be that many of the small farmers, they're using irrigation ditches that are just sand-lined. If they could just line them with clay, then they would lose far less water. Another example that actually China is doing, and it's doing a good job with, is they were worried about loss of forest habitat, which of course has implications for water. And they are paying rural people small amounts of money to engage in projects that help plant trees and preserve trees that are already there. Another thing is that just beneath Beijing, we know Beijing loses, I think it's something like 40% of its urban water is lost just due to leakage from bad pipes. There are a lot of small, and basically you have to provide the right incentives, and that means in part raising water prices, at least for those who can afford it. The biggest problem, however, for China is that all these challenges are taking place in the absence of a democratic political system. And so the mechanisms for holding people accountable are not really there. The media is not entirely free, although it is becoming more assertive about covering environmental issues. And there are times, especially when, from the Beijing's perspective, they want progress on projects that local actors are frustrating, they will encourage the media actually to cover them. So it's not an automatic that the media won't cover things, but it's hit or miss. I talked to someone dealing with a different set of issues. He was working on labor rights issues, and he said that, I think this applies to the environment too, that the media will often do a good job of covering a particular case, a particular environmental incident, or in his case, a particular labor abuse. What they're not very good at is covering the underlying structural factors that give rise to all of these incidents over and over and over again. So you know that an injustice was done, or you know that an environmental problem occurred, but you don't know why. You don't know how to fix it. You don't know who to go to. So that even the media is limited. There are a growing number of environmental NGOs. These are particularly helpful where governments want to do better but really lack the expertise or the knowledge. Environmental NGOs often work in partnership with the government. They're not confrontational for the most part. And therefore they can help encourage, educate, provide technical assistance. They can do, in a modest way, they do a lot of public education. Again, not mobilizing people to go demand stuff of their government, but more like, what does it mean to be green? And what are some ways you can, conserve water in your house, things like that. They're very good, but they don't play quite the same role that NGOs here do. And generally, the general public consciousness of environmental issues certainly has grown a lot in the last couple of decades. People are worried. They're worried. I mean, you saw the air in Harbin. They know their air is polluted. They know that the water is polluted. They're worried about it. They try as an individuals to take steps to protect themselves. They certainly want their government to do something about it. The question is now whether the mechanisms that can connect that level of public support for improving the environment to the political action, whether those can be developed over time. So I hope I was cheerful as I presented all this, but I'm always the bearer of bad news, it seems. Anyway, so that's my presentation, and I'd be happy to take any questions. Yes, sir.
David, at what point does it become a public health issue for the country as a whole, or is it there already?
Oh, it's a big public health issue. There are, particularly along the more polluted rivers, there have been documented the rise in cancer rates and many other kinds of illnesses. On air pollution, there was a study done in cities in northern China, and they found that on average, people lose about 5 years of life expectancy due to air pollution alone. So yeah, health issues are a major issue. Yes.
Have they tried to get water from, like, I know that's a long way from, I guess Mongolia is mainly desert, isn't it? I'm not sure, but I think it is. But like Russia, do they have extra water? Of course, that's a long way.
Well, that's an interesting point because there are as many Chinese immigrants in Siberia as there are Russians. And a lot of the Russians are worried that, well, we have all the resources. China has all the people. We don't have any people there in that part of our country. They wonder whether China someday will want to take over that part of Russia. There have been no steps to do that, but there certainly has been a lot of efforts to use to create to feed China's needs through resources from that part of Russia. I've heard nothing about water being diverted, but the Chinese like big, massive schemes. One thing to remember is that while most American politicians who reach high levels are lawyers, in China they're mostly engineers. They were trained as engineers. That's how they think about problems, engineering solutions. The bigger the better. Jerry?
Lots of people, lots of Americans are worried about China and the fact that they have all our money. We send all our dollars there. People have talked about China being the future. Maybe in 50 years we'll all be speaking Chinese. Are you worried about China in that way? It sounds like their problems are so big that they have greater challenges themselves than we do with them.
Well, I think it's sort of a tough race on whether to be more worried about China's rise or China's possible falling apart. I mean, either could pose very different kinds of challenges, but in some ways, look, I'm not a prognosticator, but I do think that we underestimate China's vulnerabilities and its serious internal weaknesses. And I think these are, the environmental ones and resources, and we just talked about water today. We could talk about air pollution. We could talk about natural resources. There are a lot of serious bottlenecks that China's going to face. Another big one is demographics. China's been through the demographic sweet spot where they had basically about 30% of their population were either old or young and the rest working age. They're going to shift that and become 30% working age, 70% mostly old and a few young in the next 40 years. And this is fundamentally going to change China's growth trajectory toward the downward slope. So they have some big challenges. They're surrounded by a lot of other significant powers in a way that we're certainly not. And their political system is good at big things. They can build lots of high-speed rail lines. You know, they can build South North water transfer projects. They can build three-gorgeous dams, but they can't make sure your drinking water is clean. There's a lot of things that China's political system can't do very well, in part because it's not accountable, and people don't have the same opportunity to participate. So I do think we often exaggerate China's rise and the potential problems it creates, and we ought to think more about what would happen if China, collapsed in political instability.
Does it have to become a democracy first before it fixes these things?
Well, there's a kind of a teleological view that all history tends toward a liberal democratic outcome. That was Francis Fukuyama's famous thesis. I don't believe in that. I don't think there's any necessary or required endpoint for societies. China is going to try to. The leadership again they're not unaware of these issues. Not only the environmental, but even the political issues, and they're aware of the corruption in the party. They're aware that they're not getting the best ideas when things are so constrained. So they have their own recipe for trying to reform the party, and it's based upon lessons from their own history, from the Soviet Union's example under Gorbachev. And it's not taking a liberal democratic direction. So they want to modernize the party, but not necessarily to democratize the party.
It appears that the coal industry, both mining and burning it, is a key to both the air and water pollution in China. To what extent are the engineers looking at alternatives like wind energy or solar?
They are rapidly expanding wind energy, rapidly expanding solar energy. The problem is that those start from such a tiny base, and then you remember they're growing at, even today, they were growing at 10% a year, now they're growing maybe 7.5% per year of their economy. So their energy needs are growing apace, and that means that the even rapid growth in renewable energy is not fast enough to even keep up with the added demand each year, much less start cutting back on coal's place in the economy. So at some point, as these renewable industries grow, it will begin to have a bigger effect. But for the moment, for the next decade or two, coal's still going to be used on a very heavy basis. Now, they are closing down the most inefficient and dirtiest coal plants and building the most state-of-the-art, lowest emission, most efficient coal plants. They have the only major, to my knowledge, the only major commercial scale, what do you call it? Where you put the carbon dioxide down in the air. Yeah, carbon sequestration plant. They're actually ahead on that technology. So they're trying to do some of those kind of things. They also are starting to import coal from other countries that is less, heavy. It's less soft. It's cleaner burning. But whereas most countries are cutting back on coal, closing coal, putting moratoriums on coal, China's still building lots of coal plants. I think back here I saw first.
Yeah, what does it say about the importing food products here from China in terms of the pollution and the quality?
Okay, there are serious quality issues. The tilapia that we imported, they found that was not very safe. I don't know that we import a lot of, large-scale food imports from China, but there's some specialty imports that we do import. Not just food, but also products, the toys with lead and all that kind of thing. Those are issues. Looking at it the other way, China's going to continue to import more and more food from the United States, especially corn and soy. And the reason is because, while China's population is not growing rapidly anymore, its population is growing wealthier. And as they get wealthier, they eat more meat. Meat is very grain intensive, much more so than eating the grain directly. So for every 10% rise in income in the United States, we eat 1% more meat. In China, for every 10% rise in income, they eat 11% more meat. So very rapidly growing. They're using all their arable land. They're already at the world peak in terms of food that you get per acre. Yield, thank you. I'm getting old, Jerry can tell you. Yield per acre, right, in rice and in wheat. They're already at the top. So any additional gains are just going to be small incremental. Corn, they're not near the top, they're kind of the world average. So they have some major gains they could do with corn if they make some adjustments. But in general, they're going to struggle to produce more food. They're losing cropland. And they're going to have to import more, and that's going to mean higher food prices in the future. And it's going to mean Iowans are going to be selling a lot of soybean to China.
Are they putting cropland into growing cotton and fabrics for products that they ship here?
Well, cotton is very water intensive. I don't know much about their cotton crop, how much they produce or if they export it. But I know it's very water intensive, so that's probably would be a tough one for them.
I was just thinking in terms of the different coal, the different fuels that they're using, and sadly, with the abundance of algae, are they doing research on conversion of algae into fuels? I mean, making the silk out of the sows, perhaps.
I don't know, but my guess is that somebody in China is researching every possible option. I mean, they recognize this is one of their big challenges, and they're looking at everything, believe me.
Just to mention other energy, what about nuclear?
Yep, they're expanding rapidly. So in the back.
Is the water flow change going to do to both the water supply and the political implications to Southeast Asia?
Well, the water is coming from the Yangtze River, and that flows into the Pacific. So the western, it's the other map that I wanted to bring back up. The Pearl River and the Mekong are the ones that have more influence on Southeast Asia, especially the Mekong. So, yeah, down in this region. That's where the dam building is causing serious tensions. However, it's hard for the Laos and Vietnam and Cambodia and Burma. It's hard for them to point fingers because they're building dams like crazy also. So everybody's building dams. Len?
What do you feel as far as U.S. corporate interests? Are they putting pressure? I mean, if I'm John Deere with a plant in the north, or GM or Apple, I mean, I've got to be concerned about my access to water. There's lots of expats living in China now that are trying to find, organic milk because they're afraid what they're drinking over there and everything else. So
I think,
are you hearing corporations saying to Chinese leadership, we got to deal with this, or?
I think it's definite that they're getting that. Actually, when I was in Shanghai this summer, I was teaching this 2-week short course on water. And it was interesting because there were a group of expats at all the big corporations, Apple and Disney and all the big Western and Japanese corporations. These were top executives who had formed this kind of group, and they had been given some land, not to own, but to use, along a river, the Yingchang River, not river, but lake. This is a lake where it's famous for its hairy crabs. Anybody ever seen? You can look up on the web at hairy crabs. They're a delicacy apparently in China, and they pull about I think it's about 100,000. What is it? It's a large amount of money they get from these hairy crabs each year. So this one lake, of all the lakes, this one lake is pristine. Nobody's even allowed to fish on it. There's no industrial discharge into it or anything like that. And they have this piece of land along the lake, and basically they're turning it into like an organic demonstration garden. And they're developing all these environmental stations, and they'll show you how, black rice here, and then honeybee combs here, and they're going to bring kids through and show them how to be environmentally sustainable. And the government supports that kind of project.
The executives are creating this?
Yes, yeah. And they have bike runs and things like that, and dinners and stuff. And this is supported by the local government. They think it looks good, but certainly I think the government is aware that it's hard to get the best people to come, and especially hard to get them to stay if the air looks like it does in Harbin, or even half that bad, and if the water's unsafe. And so that is a consideration, but it's not just for foreigners, it's for Chinese. Wealthy Chinese, there was a survey saying that almost 60% of wealthy Chinese, however that was defined in the survey, said that either they were in the process of immigrating or they had plans to immigrate, to leave China. And then even a larger percentage were sending their children to be educated abroad. And while they're at it, try to make sure their children get green cards or whatever. They, once they have enough money, they don't want to live in these surroundings. They don't want to live in an environment that is so polluted and seems to be getting worse. So China has to worry about that. We have about 5 minutes.
My question pertains more to air, but I'm thinking you might know it. How much of this pollution are we actually breathing?
Oh, it's amazing. If you look at the satellite images, there's this big brownish, grayish cloud that just is going, it extends over the Pacific. And a lot of it ends up in, well, a lot of it. Pollution does reach California, the west coast of the United States, and contributes to pollution there. There's another smaller kind of cloud that comes out of the Indian Ocean, in India. Here's the irony. Well, first of all, we haven't even talked about climate change, which is going to hit China hard. But the other thing that's ironic is that all of this pollution actually has the effect of limiting the amount of the sun's rays that reach the Earth, and actually has a cooling effect. So that one of the things that the climate scientists have been kind of puzzled about is that when they look at the amount of greenhouse gases we put in the air, they would expect that we actually should be a little hotter than we are now. And one reason we're not is because there's so much air pollution coming out of these factories in China that it actually acts as a kind of shield in a way. And that if they cleaned up their act and stopped polluting air, then the atmosphere would kind of jump a little bit in temperature. So, let's see if someone has to ask a question.
Well, I just wondered about you just mentioned the desalination plants on the coast. Is there dozens, hundreds? Are they really expanding that?
I wish I did know the numbers. I know it's not hundreds. We're probably talking about dozens in the planning stages. I don't know how many. If they have any running now, it would be a very small number. But I know it's something that they're looking seriously at. Did you were shaking your head, did you happen to know the answer to that one? So, not, or anybody, if anybody knows an answer I don't know, or wants to correct me, please feel free. Judy, did you have a question?
Well, I wanted to talk about auto emissions and what controls and how effective they might be.
Well, when I first went to China, they were still, in '96, they were still using leaded gasoline. They've got rid of that now. And actually, their miles per, what do you call it? The fuel efficiency standards in China are higher than those in the United States. And recently, Beijing is going to a system where during periods when air pollution is particularly bad, they will announce, to the public that for this many days you have to follow a system of odd and even numbered license plates. So, only half the cars would be permitted to come into the city, and the other half would have to stay out of the city, and the next day they switch. So during periods of particular high pollution, they'll do that. Yeah, and that's a contributing factor, but it's not nearly as big as coal. Hong Kong has liquid propane gas that they use in their taxis, and they've done everything they can to try to limit the amount of pollution coming from Hong Kong itself. It doesn't make much difference because it just comes over the border from Shenzhen, and the days that Shenzhen's factories are running, it's terrible, and when they shut down for National Day, actually for a whole week, then the air gets nice again. Well, thank you all for coming, and I hope it was useful in some way.